Episode 9, AD 960 to 1070. In 1988, the American historian Patrick Geary wrote a book with the excellent title of Before France and Germany. This is a startling idea, since it proposes that there was a time when these so familiar to us national entities did not exist. However, the following year, when the publishing house Flammarion brought out a translation of the book on the French market, they shamelessly changed the title to La naissance de la France, the birth of France, a marketing ploy which reset the message of the book's content to the diametrical opposite of the writer's intention. Such is the force of the shibboleths of national identity that historical truth finds itself either suppressed outright by or else subjected cynically to the censor's scissors. But indeed there was a Europe before the one we have been told about by the monarchs of the Baroque era and then by the ideologues of nationalism. And this original Europe was not just before France and Germany, as Geary's book shows, but also before Spain, Italy, Britain, Poland, etc. If there is one thing that the study of history shows us, it is that quite clearly people's ideas about their collective belonging, about their identity, are highly malleable, and that, given sufficient time and a certain combination of political and social factors, identities can change and be changed radically. We have already seen that there was a place and an ethnic identity of Frankenland, or Francia in Latin, the region that had been politically taken over by the Frankish foederati in the 400s and 500s AD. The homelands of Francia lay between the lower Rhine and across the Meuse to the Seine and down to the Loire. They comprised of two elements, Old Francia or Austrasia, the land of origin of the Franks, and New Francia or Neustria, between the Meuse and the Loire. This was a real country, a coherent territory whose political community shared a clear sense of collective identity, of belonging and of being the heirs to a distinct culture. Where did this single and vigorous entity go? Where are Austrasia and Neustria today? Where is Francia itself? Part of the answer is that the name Francia was appropriated by a region within it, its western half, to become Francie, and centuries later to become La France. But the more fundamental answer is that the body of Frankish Francia, at a specific point in time, was rent apart, was artificially partitioned by the contestants in a dynastic dispute. And the definitions, the nomenclature that the rivals fabricated was, with time, made to stick. The first destabilizing change came with Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony. The original, primordial Germania had been that of the Roman Rhineland and Roman Upper Danube, places like Ratisbon, modern Regensburg, Augsburg, Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Metz, and Trier. The absorption of Saxony gradually led to the formation of a new layer of Germania, composed of Saxony, Bavaria, Thuringia, Swabia, and significantly Franconia. The rallying of the dukes of these regions around the elected king of East Francia, Otto I, and his victory over the Magyars at Lechfeld in 955, signalled the arrival of a new power in Europe, a Frankish-Saxon one, but now projected further east beyond the ancestral homelands of the Franks. Otto, Odo in the Western dialect, was Duke of Saxony, then the elected king of Eastern Francia, and in 962 the Pope crowned him Roman Emperor of the West. It was this last title and its political implications which upset the equilibrium in Francia. His brother king in the West at that time could still say that he, Lotharius, in contrast to Otto, was of the Stirps Regia, the royal race of the Carolingians. His family's hold on the throne was under long-term challenge by the family of the Robertians, as explained in the previous episode, and his greatly shrunken realm was politically weak. But the prestige of the Carolingian name weighed in his family's minds much heavier than that of the upstart dukes of Saxony, who now appeared on the stage not only as equals, but as imperial superiors. Lotharius' own mother, by the way, was Gerberga, a Saxon princess. Such were the interlinkages between the East and the West at this time. On Otto's return from Rome in 965, bearing the imperial diadem given him by the Pope, he held a celebration for the great ones of Francia at the imperial residence of Cologne. Lotharius was invited along with other members of his family. As king of West Francia, Lotharius, directly descended from Charlemagne, had to raise his cup to toast the new emperor of Latin Christendom, who by implication was king over the Occidental kings. On his return to West Francia, Lotharius had his chancery imitate Otto's imperial seal. He was not going to accept either subordination or unequal status. A West Frankish Carolingian was an emperor in his own right, in his own kingdom. In 978, Lotharius launched a surprise invasion of the sacral centre of the Frankish realms at Aquisgrana, Aachen, and nearly captured Emperor Otto. Otto in turn tried to take Paris but failed. At issue territorially was the Middle Kingdom, Lotharingia, from whence the name Lorraine, which was retained by the emperor in the end and was to remain an integral part of the empire, an entity nowadays thought of as Germany, until the late 1600s. This then is the actual origin, the moment of ethnogenesis of France. And by a long-delayed historical knock-on effect, specifically by the agency of the Napoleonic Wars, the event which was to one day lead to the formulation of a specifically German national identity. This foundational fact, as distinct from myth, was a fit of dynastic peak and had nothing even remotely to do with nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors the Gauls, just as the origins of Germany have nothing to do with the Teutons. The terms Gallic and Teutonic, as we employ them, are complete fabrications. The Kingdom of West Francia, then, solidified as a political project of the dying Carolingian dynasty, in reaction against the assumption of the imperial crown by the Dukes of Saxony, kings of the eastern part of Francia. As those Saxon emperors, the Ottonians, became more identified with their Roman and imperial dignity, and thereby involved with the affairs of Italy and with the papacy, so too did the weak Carolingians of the West, and from 988 their Capetian successors, ever more systematically assert their claim to the whole of the Frankish identity and to its political heritage. As Greater East Francia became the Imperium Romanum, and later the Holy Roman Empire, so too did West Francia get away with the appropriation of the name Francia all to itself. The historian Fernand Braudel reports that still in the late 1600s a local man could point to the river Rhône, saying that to the east lay l'Empire, the empire, and to the west la France, France. These names and the concepts of community behind them would stick for 600 years and more. Between 978 and 1056, then, the interfamily links between West and East Francia broke down completely. After 1056, it was to be nearly a century before an emperor and a Rex Francorum, king of the Franks, would meet again face to face. The guardians of culture and its innovators, the monks of the royal monasteries, promulgated in the 990s and 1000s the essential claims and self-understandings of these feeble kings of the Franks. In the 990s, Richer of Saint-Rémy wrote a new type of history which limited itself exclusively to the western part of Francia. And by borrowing from Julius Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, set up the idea that the ancient Gauls had been the ancestors of the Capetian kings. The monk Émouin, in his chronicle Libri Quinque de Gestis Francorum, invented a Frankish nation, the Natio Francorum, giving it a distinguished Trojan descent. This Trojan genealogy of the French remained the dominant one right down to the 1600s. The contemporary Historia Francorum Senonensis linked three dynasties as a continuum, the Merovingians, the Carolingians, and the Capetians. In order to retain a neat sequence, all the Robertian kings and anti-kings between 888 and 923 were finessed by the writer out of his scheme. Of course, these ideological recastings of the past to meet the needs of the newly emerging present were known only to a small group at the abbeys and in the inner royal circle. But with time they became the historical truth and provided the central themes, the lieu de mémoire, for the French kings and their political community throughout the Middle Ages and far beyond. This is why the French monarchy was very different in character from the empire in Germany and Italy. The French concept, from and because of its inception, was that of a sacral dynasty's God-given sovereignty. In the empire, the emperorship remained right through to the 1600s a God-ordained and Pope-confirmed office of the temporal head of Christendom, sharing a presiding authority alongside the Pope over all of Christendom. The resurrection of the Western Roman Empire in 962 AD in the person of Otto I, made possible by the victory at Lechfeld, created an institution and set a pattern of political life that lasted unbroken until 1806, when Napoleon brusquely swept the Western Roman Empire away. But in the early 1000s it was the greatest power in the Occident. It looked south to Italy, at least to its northern half, and it looked east into the endless expanse of Slavonia, the lands of the Slavs. The Magyars, who were not Slavs, as we have seen, had settled down in Pannonia, forming the new Christian kingdom of Hungary. They were becoming part of a much wider process whereby the pagan Slavic tribes of southern and East Central Europe were transforming themselves into post-tribal societies, becoming Christianized and acquiring a hierarchical social structure and the rudiments of a monetary economy. The warrior elites of Poland and Bohemia were dissolving the traditional tribal political and social structures. Power was concentrating in the hands of princes and their clientels. These Slavic clientels were the druinia, held together by the prince through his military prowess, his moral suasion over them, and above all by the prospect of the wealth and thereby prestige to be gained through booty won in warfare. It was to these Slavic princes that the Christian missionary bishops made their way, to their palisaded military villages, such as the one at Hradčany Hill, the origin of Prague, or at Gniezno, in what is now western Poland. It was with these princes that the dukes and counts of East Francia sought to intermarry and gain hereditary rights to the new lands in Slavonia. It was to these princes that the youthful and visionary Emperor Otto III set out from Rome on a pious and diplomatic mission in the year 1000. Otto had come to visit the Polish prince at Gniezno, presenting him with the Holy Lance of Longinus, supposedly used at the crucifixion. We remember that this item was returned by Emperor Heraclius to Jerusalem in 630 AD. Nevertheless, it was an immense honor and a sincere one. Further, Otto established an archbishopric at the settlement of Gniezno, setting aside his father's scheme to have the Church of the Poles subordinated to the Archbishop of Magdeburg. This is the origin of the autonomous Polish Catholic Church. A similar decision was made in relation to Bohemia. The breakup of tribal society in the whole region of Slavonia saw a harsh encirclement of the population by the arms-bearing warrior elite. In a wide circumference around a palisaded grody, or fortress settlement, thus Novgorod in Russia, scores of villages served no other function than to supply the warriors at will with food and artifacts. Villages whose peasant slaves were obliged to perform any corvée or forced labor at the command of their overlords. Only very slowly did the process of Christianization and Westernization introduce a more sophisticated form of social hierarchy, entailing a mitigation of the living conditions of the peasantry. But the process of conversion, of aristocratic intermarriage, of papal and imperial honors and patronage, of the new elites was working a transformation in these societies and extending Latin Christendom decisively into the eastern regions of the European continent. The relative security and stability brought by the Ottonian emperors provided the framework for normal agricultural life to resume, as it did for the re-emergence of commercial activity. By the late 900s, the old Roman cities north of the Alps were in a sorry state, many of them having been ravaged during the Viking and Magyar predations. The nobility was ruralizing. The public buildings had long since been quarried for defensive and building materials. Depopulation meant that some spaces within the walls were now free to be used for orchards, vegetable gardens and grazing. But now in northern Lotharingia, the cities began to grow again like phoenixes, and with a vigour they had not previously shown. In places like Arras, with its old Roman walls, Valenciennes, Cambrai, Maastricht, Bruges, Liège, the social type of the bourgeois is to be found again. In the 19th century, Karl Marx pejoratively misappropriated this word, but originally it meant someone living within the inner walls of a city, the burgus, which once had meant a Roman fort. These were the core of the citizenry, the shopkeepers, innkeepers, and artisans of all kinds. Already in the late 900s, some of them could afford to endow churches, which had not happened since Merovingian times. The commercial functions exercised by Syrian merchants in Merovingian times were now exercised by locals. As their wealth increased, the tradesmen and merchants of the towns began to assert a claim to rights and to demand immunities and privileges from the overlord of the district. They also came into conflict with the authority in place, their bishop. Alpertus, bishop of Metz, writing in 1024, exclaimed, quote, "These men are different from other men. They are hard-hearted people, who are dishonest, and for whom adultery is not a sin, who resolve their own disputes themselves, not according to the law, but according to their own liberty." End quote. By liberty he meant their practice of holding their own courts of justice. By 958 the citizens of Cambrai refused their bishop entry to his city. There was trouble at Liège between the burghers and their bishop in 951 and again in 971. And this was to be the pattern all across Latin Christendom, and it was to be the germ from which, over the coming centuries, European civil society was to grow. The existence of the empire created a more or less secure passage between Flanders and northern Italy, for pilgrims on their way to Rome and beyond, as well as for merchants. The traffic had become significant enough for the emperors to man and operate 9 permanent customs posts on all the approach roads to the Alpine passes, linking northern Europe to Italy. The Saracen raiding bands and hostage takers from Fraxinetum were replaced by imperial customs officials, exacting a regular and much milder tribute for safe passage and for the common good. Italy, by the turn of the year 1000 AD, was returning to the position it had held in Merovingian times and before, as the transit emporium for most of the merchandise and people passing from northern Europe to and from Constantinople and other Mediterranean ports. New money in the north was eagerly spent on the high quality and sophisticated styles of the artifacts and clothes produced in the workshops of Constantinople, still the apogee of craftsmanship and design. Venice, which in the 600s had been a salt and fishing settlement of refugees from the passing Lombards, Avars, and Magyars, had by 1000 become a naval power of great significance. Venetian galleys and fighting men had been contracted by the Eastern Emperor to clear the Adriatic of Muslim corsairs, that is, Muslim pirates. Venice, once a city within the empire and subject to the Exarch at Ravenna, had long since broken free and established a turbulent political life of its own, with a popular democracy, the great families, who vied for support at the assembly of the popolo, or the people, who by acclamation, the publicum placitum, elected the duke or doge, who held executive power, and who ruled in conjunction with a council of boni homines, good men, the most senior bourgeois of the city. A foundational moment for Venice, still a city nominally ruled by Constantinople, came in 828, when the super-prestigious relic of the body of Saint Mark, one of the four evangelists, was stolen by a crew of Venetian merchants from under the noses of the Muslim authorities at Alexandria. They are said to have hidden it under a cargo of pork. This was regarded as a furtum sacrum, a holy theft, and they brought it home to Venice in triumph. This was a relic second only in power to those of the Saints Peter and Paul at Rome, and it became the symbol of the Venetian identity, the Republic of Saint Mark, for the centuries following. It is important to note that this relic was in the hands of the civic authorities and not of the bishop, a crucial marker for the character of Venice in religious matters. St. Mark's Basilica is the private chapel of the Doge's palace, not the seat of the bishop. On their western side, every year the Venetian delegates had to come to Pavia, still the political capital of the Western Empire in Italy, to pay a large amount of silver to the emperor for their trading privileges, as well as some pepper and fine clothes for the imperial treasurer's wife. Their fortunes were based on their trade with Constantinople, and further afield with Muslim Alexandria and the cities of the Levant. To make this seaborne traffic possible, the Venetians had to pay, throughout the 900s, an annual tribute to the Slavic pirates of the Dalmatian coast, known as the Croati, Croatians, and the Narentani. The first step to Venetian greatness came on Ascension Day 1000 AD, when Doge Pietro Orsiello attended an elaborate religious ceremony presided over by the Bishop of Olivolo, blessing the expedition he was to lead against the Schiavoni, the Slavs. The Roman cities of coastal Dalmatia had beseeched the Venetians to protect them from the predations of the Slavs, and Emperor Basil II of Constantinople had given them his mandate. The Venetian fleet was so powerful that it wiped out the pirate nests of Dalmatia, and Doge Orsiello received oaths of loyalty from the Roman cities there. Following this victory, the Dukes of Venice thenceforward entitled themselves Dux Veneticorum et Dalmaticorum, Duke of the Venetians and Dalmatians. 2 years later, in 1002, the great Roman Emperor Basil II sent ambassadors to Venice to request the aid of the now potent Venetian fleet to help lift the long Muslim siege of Bari in southern Italy, the capital city of the East Roman Catapanate of Italy, as the theme was known in Constantinople. Orsiello was again victorious, and the second Muslim attempt to set up an emirate at Bari was put an end to. Orsiello's son Giovanni was married into the imperial family at Constantinople, and the father at Venice was given an imperial title. The succeeding doges, Domenico Flabanico, 1032, Domenico Contarini, 1043, and Domenico Selvo, 1071, all similarly reinforced the Venetian alliance with the empire, and each received palatine honours from the Roman emperor. The power and wealth of Venice rose at the moment of the greatest prosperity and power of Constantinople itself, as an allied but no longer a subject Roman city. while the reaffirmation of the Western Imperium Romanum, the Ottonian one, fostered the revival of long-distance trade overland from northern Europe to Italy. The real Imperium Romanum, that at Constantinople, served as the destination and purpose of those trading expeditions. For from the mid-800s, the Roman Empire had been recovering from the impact of the Islamic invasions, as it had from the Slavic and Bulgar inundation of the Balkans. The holding back of further Islamic advances, the slow rebuilding of the army and the taxation system, allowed the core territories in Bithynia and Thrace and the Aegean coastal cities to recover. Agricultural output grew, as did the population, cumulatively from decade to decade. The fairer and more efficiently enforced taxation system raised substantial funds for the emperors to spend on the army, on diplomatic payments to manipulate dangerous neighbors, on maintaining the cities, and on luxuries like higher education and culture. The recovery was slow. In the 820s, Gregory the Decapolite wanted to travel from Ephesus to Constantinople and from there to Rome. These were still cities of the one Roman cultural world. But first at Ephesus and later at Corinth, embarking for Italy, he had great trouble finding a ship's captain willing to take the risk of being caught by Muslim hunting ships out on the high seas. When he came ashore at Chrysopolis in northern Greece, he was seized by Slavs and held captive. Such were the realities of the times. He escaped and eventually made it to Rome. But by the 840s there were definite signs of uplift. We have record of a great fortune amassed by a widow named Danielis of Patras in the Peloponnese. We even have an image of her. She made her money from cloth production. In 856 she owned large estates and had many slaves. Her own sheep provided the wool, which her female slaves in Patras wove into rugs, cloth, and other items in her workshops. In 837, Emperor Theophilus could lead an army of 70,000 men into Mesopotamia on a major invasion of Muslim territory. But Caliph al-Mutasim's even more colossal army invaded central Anatolia, defeated him, and destroyed the fortress city of Amorion. Nevertheless, in 838, Theophilus had 36,000 numismata distributed to the citizens of Baghdad, just to demonstrate the power of the Romans. In that same year of 838, the Emperor Theophilus offered the famous scholar Leo the mathematician a permanent teaching position in the Magnaura Palace, and appointed him head of the first imperially funded higher educational institution at Constantinople since before the Muslim invasions. Leo held the chair of philosophy at the Magnaura, where his student Theodorus taught geometry. Theodagius was professor of astronomy and Cometas professor of Greek. Photius also taught there, who in 830 composed the lexicon or dictionary. His Bibliotheca describes his own copious reading and the notes he made from it. Leo the mathematician was clever enough to devise an optical system of telegraphy to link Constantinople through a long chain of manned stations with the frontier in furthest Anatolia to transmit a signal when the Muslims were invading. This was in the middle of the period we call the Dark Ages. Meanwhile, on the eastern frontier of Anatolia, the predations continued, launched now by three semi-autonomous emirates, that of Melitene, of Tarsus, and of Theodosiopolis, to use their original Greek names. In 863, Omar al-Akta led tens of thousands of his troops through the Cilician gates into the Roman Empire. They headed north, reaching the Black Sea, where they took and destroyed the city of Amisos. Three Roman thematic armies had time to converge under the Emperor Michael's uncle, Petronas. The invaders were caught and annihilated at Lalakaontos. Petronas was accorded a triumph, where he was cheered by the populace of Constantinople as he led his troops and their prisoners in through the Golden Gates and through the city down the Mesa, through the forums to the Hippodrome, where he was awarded the victor's crown. This victory not only put an end to the Emirate of Melitene, but opened up an era when the Roman Empire, after having been on the defensive for 2¼ centuries, went over onto the offensive. To the north of Constantinople, the formidable Bulgar ruler Boris, who called himself Tsar after the Roman title Caesar or Caesar, was in contact with the Roman papacy and the Carolingian king of East Francia with a view to converting to Christianity. The victory at Lalaca-Ontos enabled Emperor Michael in 864 to transfer part of his army from Asia Minor to Thrace and make a demonstration of power in the south of Boris's realm. This convinced the Tsar to accept Constantinopolitan missionaries instead. Boris and his immediate family were secretly baptized according to the Eastern rites, taking the name of Michael in honor of the emperor. The Bulgarian nobility, the boyars, revolted against this religious betrayal, but were bloodily suppressed. A few decades later, the Bulgarian Christian monks at Pliska developed the form of writing known as the Cyrillic script, adapting medieval Greek for the Slavic languages, which provided the basis for the writing and literary culture of Serbia, Ukraine, and Russia. The powerful kingdom of the Bulgars was slowly being drawn towards the religious and cultural magnet of Constantinople, but politically it remained a mortal threat. A similar pattern emerged later, if we skip forward a century, in Kiev, the great power on the lower Dnieper, whose rulers were becoming Slavic, but still were recognizably Scandinavian in culture. In 949, Bishop Liutprand of Cremona in Italy observed the Kievan Rus at the court in Constantinople, describing them as Rusios, quos alion nos nomine Normanus appellamos, Russians whom we call by another name as Normans. The queen regent of Kiev was Helga or Olga, who was baptized at Constantinople probably in the 950s by the scholarly emperor Constantine VIII, who recorded the great event in his De Ceremoniis concerning the ceremonies. But her son Sviatoslav was a different matter. He was a warlord and, to maintain his honor in the eyes of his men, a staunch pagan. He first destroyed the Khazar kingdom to the east, made peace with the Pechenegs, and then took a huge subsidy from the Roman emperor to invade Bulgaria from the north. Having crushed the Bulgars, he intended to stay and to move the capital from Kiev to the mouth of the Danube. In 969, he invaded the Roman Empire itself and besieged Adrianopolis. And here we can see the military power of the Romans of Constantinople, 1,000 years after the reign of Augustus Caesar. Leontos Diaconi, Leo the Deacon, gives us an eyewitness account of the army led by Emperor Ioannis I. This was a professional army with a large body of highly drilled and well-armoured cavalry at its core, the cataphracts. These men were neither freebooters, rabble out for plunder, nor slaves in arms. They were free men, paid wages for their service, and commanded by an officer corps largely of Armenian origin, dedicated to leading their men. At one of the 6 battles of Silistria on the Danube in 971, the cataphracts formed up in a strict wedge shape, 500 strong, ready to advance at a trot. Leo reports that, quote, the evening star was already sinking when the Emperor John launched his final charge on the Rus, with devastating effect. You are Romans, he cried. Now show your valor in your deeds. The bugles sounded the charge. The battle cry rang out. The Russians wavered and fled. Their losses were enormous. End quote. This victory not only ended the ambitions of Kiev in the Balkans, but the Kievan invasion enfeebled the power of the Bulgarian Tsars themselves. Within a matter of months of these events, in 972, Emperor Ioannis was invading the Caliphate in Upper Mesopotamia. The following year he invaded Cilicia and then Syria, taking Antioch, the old Roman capital, and then Emesa, now called Homs, Heliopolis, the city of the sun, now called Baalbek, and then, astonishingly, Damascus itself. He proceeded south to take the cities of coastal Lebanon, and then Caesarea and Nazareth in Judea, 150 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Roman power was back in Syria 3.5 centuries after its collapse at Yarmouk in 636. This was not perceived by the victors as an invasion of a foreign land. In their eyes, Syria and much more rightfully belonged to the Romaioi, to the Romans in the first place. But this was the 1,000-year-old Roman political tradition, and it was the identity of the Constantinopolitans that from time immemorial Almighty God had granted to the empire dominion without end, in space and duration. And there is no doubt that in this world view, the retaking of Jerusalem was a dearly held ambition, as is shown in this poetic manifesto of 964, sent by Emperor Nicephorus Phocas to Caliph al-Muti at Baghdad. Quote, "Then I will march in all haste towards Mecca, drawing behind me a multitude of soldiers, like as the dark night. I will take that city and set up there the throne of the best of beings, that is Christ. Then I will direct myself towards Jerusalem. I will conquer all the Orient and the Occident, and I will spread in all places the religion of the cross." End quote. The zenith of this long-paced resurgence of the Roman Empire was reached under the great Emperor Basil II, 976 to 1025. He waged a 20-year campaign, finally to break the Bulgar Tsar Samuel and to make Bulgaria a Roman province, earning for himself the sobriquet Bulgaroktonos, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. The Roman frontier lay once again along the lower Danube, as it had in Justinian's day. Basil took an army of 40,000 men across Asia Minor into Syria to relieve there the beleaguered Roman duch, or dux in Latin, from which we derive our term duke. He also relieved Aleppo and took the cities already mentioned. This campaign ensured the renewed Roman rule in Syria would last a century, until 1070. It was in his reign, in 992, that a formal alliance with the Venetians was made, by the issuing of a chrysobolla, a bull or document with a golden seal, reducing the customs duties the Venetians paid at Abydos to 2 solidi on entering the port of Constantinople and 15 on leaving, showing the direction of the high-value goods being traded, in return for placing Venetian vessels at the empire's disposal for troop transport and as war galleys. This was the beginning of the Venetian privilege at Constantinople, which by 1204 was to prove the city's downfall. By 1016, the Roman armies attacked the Khazars, who had taken in the Crimea and made the Black Sea, so important to Constantinople, a Roman lake once again. On flagging, Basil launched a war against the Georgians in the Caucasus and annexed Armenia. In the Armenian highlands, he built a system of fortresses in depth facing east. In 1025, the now aged emperor was preparing a great expedition to retake the island of Sicily from the now disunited Muslim factions there. The Catapanikion, or Catapanate, of Italy already embraced the whole of the boot of the peninsula, that is, Apulia and Calabria. The taking of Sicily would have completed the restoration of Roman power. But unfortunately, the old warrior died at Constantinople before this could happen. The Roman Empire was the oldest continuous state in the world, extremely conscious and proud of its traditions. Through the 800s and 900s, its dynamic internal prosperity and territorial expansion flatly contradicts the belief of historians that all empires inevitably become stagnant, sclerotic, and fall. By 1025, it looked to contemporaries as if the world, as it had been before the Islamic invasions, was piece by piece being restored. This restored, rich, productive, and powerful empire is the context within which the recovery of the Occident occurred. The old ruptures between Italy and Constantinople were repaired, the breaches in communications restored, and the regularity of traffic re-established. And it was from this traffic that the maritime cities of Italy, and a network of those more inland, became the mercantile emporia between northern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. By the mid-1000s, in the cities of northern Italy, fortunes were being made. The groups who were enriched by trade formed their own tight political communities, each city a state unto itself, Italy of the civic communes was rapidly taking shape, a vigorous network of competing nodes which would lead Europe for the following 5 centuries and become its teachers in economics, banking, transportation, in military technology, and in what in Italy is called civiltà, a blend of our concepts of civility and civilization, which slowly radiated the sophisticated lifestyle, the manners, style, and culture of the court at Constantinople to Europe north of the Alps. We have seen how Venice rose from obscurity in the service of Constantinople, and how the empire on the Bosphorus was again the focus of Italian commerce and communications. This pattern was mirrored on the western coast of Italy by other previously Roman coastal cities, such as Amalfi and Gaeta. Amalfi was smaller but even more precocious than Venice. Its merchants became enormously wealthy by trading with Constantinople and with the Muslim ports of North Africa and the Levant, where they lived in their own colonies as dhimmi. But no matter how they were treated officially by the Fatimid caliphs, their security in the Muslim world was always fragile, as was shown in 996, when the colony of over 100 Almafitans at Cairo were all massacred in a religiously inflamed riot. And such, by the late 900s, were the interactions between individual Christian communities of Italy and the Muslim world on the other side of the Mediterranean. Regular intercourse and trade as colonies of tolerated resident aliens, paying the jizya, and then, by turns, as formidable enemies to one another. Amalfi, Gaeta, and Venice were soon joined by newly revived cities in northwestern Italy. Genoa, which had been formed by refugees from the initial Islamic conquest of Spain from Tarragona, paid an appalling price for their temerity in raiding back against the corsairs of Sicily and Mahdia in North Africa. In 935, the Emir of Mahdia had sent a powerful fleet north across the Mediterranean, which besieged, took, and utterly destroyed Genoa, slaughtering thousands of the male population and taking as many of the women and children back to Mahdia to a life of slavery that could be found. But 80 years later, the Genoan community had reconstituted itself and was ready to deal back to the Saracens the predation they had for so long themselves suffered. In 1016, the Genoese, in alliance with the Pisans, launched a joint attack on Muslim Sardinia and returned the island to Christendom. In the Tyrrhenian, as in the Adriatic Sea, the naval power of quite small Italian coastal cities was proving to be most formidable and to open up the prospect of the sudden acquisition of wealth through raiding. In 1034, the Pisans launched a raid on Beaune in present-day Algeria. In 1087, they and the Genoese made a great naval attack on Mahdia itself. Significantly for what we shall see later in this century, they wore pilgrim insignia as they crossed the sea on their way to carry out this daring attack. In 1063, the Pisans, in alliance with the Norman Robert de Guiscard, took their fleet south to the great city of Palermo, the site of the powerful Muslim naval arsenal. They broke the chain blocking the mouth of the harbour and sacked the anchored ships and the city beneath the citadel, which they failed to take, before retiring home with an enormous booty. This wealth enabled the Pisans to begin building the, for the time, massive structure of the Cathedral of Santa Maria Assunta in the Campo dei Miracoli, the Field of Miracles, beside which stands the later belfry, the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa. The maritime cities of western Italy showed, after centuries of suffering, that the business of sudden Saracen raids from the sea, of plunder and destruction, was no longer a one-way traffic. The power of the Italian fleets marked a great change in the balance of power on the Mediterranean high seas. Since the 650s, for over 3 centuries, Muslim fleets could raid and invade almost at will, especially in the western Mediterranean. The fleet of the emperor at Constantinople regained much of its former strength, but still was not able to really dominate the eastern Mediterranean. But from the late 900s, the Italian maritime republics proved themselves a formidable opponent to any Muslim expedition. Strategically, this meant that for the first time, Italian ships and their war galley escorts were available to transport a Western army to any point in the Mediterranean. This was a strategic precondition for the Crusades, and for much else that was to occur in the following centuries. In 1027, a monk at the great Burgundian monastery of Cluny, Rodolphus Glabros, looking back to the year 1000, recorded his impression of a world being reborn as Western Christendom reached the first millennium. He saw evidence of renewal above all in the landscape being spread with a new white garment, candidam vestam, of churches. It was as if the whole world had shaken off the dust of the ages and covered itself in a white mantle of churches. End quote. The whiteness indicates pride in the fact that, after so many had been burned and destroyed over the previous 150 years, these churches and monasteries were stone-built at immense expense, while ordinary buildings were made of wood, wattle, and thatch. One can catch the revolutionary character of this great movement of building renewal in the recorded outrage of a local chieftain of County Down in Ireland in 1124. A century later, but novelties took time to reach peripheral regions. Bishop Malachy began a program of vigorous reform intended to make the people of his diocese conform to what he called Roman laws, that is, to obey the rulings of canon law on such subjects as confession, marriage, and the payment of tithes. As a visible and tangible symbol of this thrust to Romanize the Irish, he had constructed at Bangor a dressed stone oratory, the like of which had never been seen before. St. Bernard, Malachy's biographer, reports the reaction of the bishop's local chief opponent. Quote, "What has induced you to bring this innovation to our part of the world? Scoti sumus, non Galli. We are Irish, not French," he declared. An interesting choice of terms. These new monasteries and churches were built by the local lords, abbots, and bishops, who now formed the uppermost echelon of this newly reforming society. They comprised two of the three ordines, orders, as Adalbero Laudunensis wrote in 1027, which were the oratores, the prayers, the bellatores, the fighters, et laboratores, the workers. The bellatores were also, on remark by Rudolphus, clothing the landscape in tall and formidable stone buildings, castles. It is probable that no other place on earth has anything like the topographical density of castles and castle ruins that Western Europe has. The reason for this is part and parcel of the peculiar long-term political evolution of Europe and later the West that grew from it. Around the year 1000, Europe was emerging from 150 years of predation, insecurity, and political disintegration. By the time this ended, political power and with it authority was nowhere identifiable with a centre. There were powers everywhere, localized and operating within narrow provincial contexts. The regional overlords, the counts and dukes, who were no longer answerable to or removable by a Carolingian king, derived their own power from the loyalty of the seigneurs, who ruled estates and held castles of their own within the county, and who gave their military support to the count because it was politically advantageous for them to do so. These were the fideles, the faithful, the count's own men, who came with their contingents when summoned to war against their overlord's enemies. They came also for reward for their services. What was taken from the neighbouring lord would in part be handed over as portions to them, as beneficia, benefits. Frontiers bristling with fortifications were traced through what we now know as modern France, especially in the north. A figure characteristic of the age was the Comte d'Anjou, the Count of Anjou, Fulk Nera. He fought for over 50 years against his immediate neighbours, the equally aggressive Count of Blois, his archenemy, and also against those of Brittany, Touraine, Maine, Normandy, and Champagne. The king of the Franks, the Capetian Robert II, was just another player in this regional chessboard, not a monarch to be feared and obeyed, but respected on account of his illustrious title and kingly pretensions. Fulk Nerra was a great builder, and a builder of strong castles in the first place. To finance these, he was partly successful in enforcing a divisio, or 50-50 division of ecclesiastical revenues between himself and the abbeys and churches of his realms. For his castles were expensive, and they were many. His great obsession was to take possession of the county of Touraine, with Tours as its chief city, from the Count of Blois. This led to a half-century of perpetual warfare between the two men. The way to fight was to build castles, châteaux forts, in a network pattern, each one dominating a strategic river valley. In Fulk Nerra's case, those of the Cher, the Indre, the Indrois, the Manse, etc. Among the more notable chateaux he built and garrisoned were those of Montbazon, Montrésor, Saint-Maur, Langeais, and Semblancay. These were real frontier fortresses, no less so than the Maginot Line of the 1930s, meant to beat off invasion, as well as to provide forward bases for descents in force down those valleys into the heart of the neighbour enemy's domains, to lay those domains waste at will. The castle's positioning in the landscape, their interconnections and their design and construction testify to a highly conscious rationality and most careful planning that were at work. For the Occident had adopted a set of martial techniques which in combination were to give it the military strength and means to expand over the following 400 years. The most aggressive, in an aggressive world, of these comital lords were the Dukes of Normandy, the land of the Northmen, Normandie. As elsewhere, the dukes, beginning with Richard II, were determined to weld their warrior clients into a reliable and effective military force. In Normandy, above all, this meant the imposition of ducal authority over the domains of the nobility, by the appointment to those domains of the duke's own agents. In 1035, Duke Robert of Normandy had died while returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It is noteworthy that in Constantinople he had met up with none other than Fulk Nerra, who was on his third 5-year-long pilgrimage. And the two lords, so ruthless and cruel at home, set off across Anatolia together in all piety and humility. Robert insisted on walking barefoot at first, but after a few days his lacerated feet obliged him to be carried in a litter. Fulk was no less fervent, for once in Jerusalem he had 2 of his servants tie him naked to a wicker rack and drag and flog him with branches through the streets, sous les yeux des infidèles, under the eyes of the infidels, all the way to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, as he cried out, "Lord, have pity on the traitorous and perjured Fulk. Jesus, forgive my supplicant soul." The long absence of its duke from Normandy had allowed resentment to fester, and in 1047 to break out into open revolt. The jarls or earls of western Normandy, who were less assimilated to Christian and Frankish culture than their eastern peers, tried to ambush and assassinate the young successor duke, Guillaume or William, called Le Bâtard, the Bastard, but they failed. These still pagan or superficially Christianizing Scandinavians mounted a full-scale assault on their duke, their 2 armies clashing at Val-es-Dunes near Caen. The rebels were defeated, and Duke Guillaume exiled many of them and seized their estates. He thereby succeeded in imposing the greatest degree of political control over his nobility of any overlord of Europe. The defeated and exiled Norman lords left, not for the neighbouring counties, but they travelled the 1,800 kilometres south to Calabria in southern Italy. Decades before, in 1016, Norman pilgrims visiting Monte Gargano in Apulia had been invited by a local Lombard lord to come to his aid in resisting the Roman Imperial catapan of Bari. We can note here that these pilgrims probably had brought their arms with them, and the Lombards saw them as a potential military force. On returning to Normandy, the pilgrims told of the fertility and richness of southern Italy. Over the following decades, groups of armed men left for Salerno to fight as mercenaries, first in the pay of the Lombards, then by turns for the Roman Emperor against them. Many men from Blois, Flanders, Anjou, and Francy left with them. The Romans from Constantinople quite accurately called them all Franki. This was to be the ethnic term applied by both Greeks and Muslims to all crusaders over the coming centuries. The Norman lords proved themselves to be remarkably effective fighters, regularly defeating the Saracens, Lombards, and the Romans. They even defeated the elite corps of the Imperial Varangian Guard sent from Constantinople, who were their own distant, axe-wielding kinsmen. The Varangians had come from Scandinavia by way of Kiev. Harald Hardrada, whom we will meet later as King of Norway, was among their number. In 1038, the Normans formed a major element in the Roman general George Maniace's initially successful invasion of the Emirate of Sicily. But while the Romans had proven that the Muslims of Sicily could be defeated, the Lombard princes and the Norman warlords could not remain united under the high-handed Roman general. The arrival in the 1040s of two families from Normandy, the Quarel d'Rengo and the de Hauteville, gave vigorous leadership to the Normans, who set out to conquer the region on their own account. By 1042, the Normans had divided Apulia among their chiefs. By 1058, they had subjugated the Lombard principalities of Salerno and Benevento. The new rising star among them was Robert Guiscard, who was conquering Lower Calabria by building a network of castles in the strategic valley of the Crati, centered on the fortress of Scribla. In 1059, at his home castle of Melfi, Pope Nicholas II invested Robert Guiscard with the duchies of Apulia and Calabria, and the future duchy of Sicily if he could conquer it back from the Muslims. Apulia and Calabria in fact constituted the Roman catapanate of Italy, with a partly Greek-speaking ruling class, and was the sovereign possession of the continuing Roman Empire at Constantinople. The papacy was thereby taking a major step towards an overtly imperial role for itself as the dispenser of legitimacy in the east, that is in southern Italy, as it was in the west. Just 5 years before, there had been dramatic scenes in the Basilica of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, when the Pope's legate, Cardinal Umbertus, who was present also at Guiscard's coronation, had solemnly excommunicated Patriarch Cerularius, who in turn excommunicated him and Pope Leo IX. Actions which formalized a breakdown of relations between the Latin and Greek-speaking churches. The process of separation between the Greek Orthodox and Latin Catholic Church was intimately connected with the challenge to Roman imperial authority by the politically chaotic but increasingly militarily potent Latin West. While papal sponsorship and legitimation of normal rule in Roman territories was a conscious usurpation of imperial authority in southern Italy, it was also a program to mobilize the lords of Latin Christendom to take back territories long since lost to Islam, in this case Sicily. The Normans were to hold the former imperial catapanate of southern Italy and the Emirate of Sicily as fiefs, directly from the throne of St. Peter. They were to bear the papal banner into battle, the Vexillum Sancti Petri, the banner of St. Peter, symbolizing that they had acted with papal authority on behalf of all Christendom, that they were fighting a war which had a sacred purpose. This same banner was willingly given to Guillaume, Duke of Normandy, in 1066, when he sent ambassadors to Rome seeking papal sanction for his planned crossing of the Channel to assert his right to succeed his cousin, Edward the Confessor, who had recently died. Pope Alexander II sent his signifer papae, the papal standard-bearer, to confer his blessing on the enterprise by giving the vexillum sancti Petri to the Duke's expeditionary force. The date 1066 is, of course, the most famous in English history, and a large body of identity attitudes commonly resonates with it. Here is a succinct summary of those given by Professor Sarah Foote on the BBC's In Our Time series.
The Norman yoke is really a myth, an historical construct that argues that when the Normans colonised England after their victory at Hastings in 1066, that they then deprived the free Anglo-Saxons of their native historic liberty, that they didn't just take their lands away from all the noble ruling classes, but even lesser people who had previously held land by right of inheritance now held land of Norman lords through service or by contract, that they took away the free laws of the Anglo-Saxons, imposed their own tyrannical constructs and unjust judges, that women lost the native freedoms that Germanic women had historically had in terms of law and landowning, that the church was taken over, Anglo-Saxon saints' relics were thrown out and burnt, and that foreign Normans came in and took over English churches, so that it's a wholesale tyrannical imposition of an outside foreign rule, putting a yoke on the necks of the formerly free English.
Such a story may be okay for a bunch of blokes down the pub, but a far more interesting and realistic picture emerges if one looks at these events with a more detached eye. The terms one uses are, as always, important. I propose, as much as is tolerable, to use terms from the time itself, because of the force of verbal association. So, for example, rather than England, I will use Englaland from the nearly contemporary Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The deep background is important also. During the late 800s, the separate Saxon kingdoms of Englaland came within a hair's breadth of being overwhelmed entirely by a very strong Norse invasion and migration. The kingdom of Wessex, the West Saxons in the south, remained as a rump and sole survivor. In 878, the Wessex king, Elfred, had divided the island with his Danish opponent, leaving the east from the Mersey down to the Thames estuary, just outside London, in Norse hands, as the Danelagen, the Danelaw. In addition, there was substantial Danish settlement in the kingdom of Mercia. It is important to note that this involved not only a replacement or coexistence of one warrior aristocracy with another, but also a significant migration of population from Denmark to the east and central parts of the island. Eastern Englaland was Denmark across the sea, with regular trading, communications and family ties, and united by language, customs and shared outlook. The shock of the Danish conquest had shattered the age-old independent kingdoms of Englaland and created for the first time the possibility of a single crown over the whole of what had originally been the Roman province of Britannia. In a very real sense, the Danish invasions created the project of an England as a united kingdom. The struggle for that newly fashioned heritage, the crown of Englaland, did not at all end with King Elfred in the 880s. A revival of the Kingdom of Wessex in the early 900s saw the imposition of its rule upon the Danish and Anglo-Danish earls or jarls of the Danelaw. But the Anglo-Saxon political community, centred on the House of Wessex, remained a fragile and indeed a transitory phenomenon. From the late 900s, a second great wave of Danish raids and invasions, just as formidable as the first, gathered momentum. By the reign of King Ethelred, the survival of Anglo-Saxon rule was in question. The scale and frequency of the raids and invasions can be measured by the recorded payments of the gaffol, or danegeld, the vast quantities of protection money which the Saxons of Wessex thought it wiser to collect and hand over to the Norsemen, rather than suffer their predations or to meet them in battle. A gaffol was paid after the crushing defeat of local forces at Maldon in 991, amounting to 3,300 kilograms of silver, laid at the feet of the Norsemen. There are rune stones standing in Sweden recording that this or that jarl had taken gaffol in England. This was followed in 994 by another to buy off the siege of London, and again in 1002. In 1007, Ethelred paid a sum of 13,400 kilograms of silver. In 1012, the Norse burned the greatest cathedral church on the island, that of Cantwaraburik, killing the archbishop, and had to be bought off with a payment of 17,900 kilograms of silver. Note here that we use the French mispronunciation of the Saxon word Cantwaraburik as Canterbury, Canterbury. The reason we do so will become clear later. The gaffol or danegeld was collected in a regular fashion by Saxon royal officials, imposing a rate upon each hide, manse or carucate. A caruca was Latin for a plough. The raiders were kinsmen of the Danish population long settled in the east of the island. There were clusters of Norse farmers and townsmen scattered across central England, in Mercia. There were further enclaves on the west coast, in extension of the long-standing Norse settlements in Ireland and the Isle of Man. In 1002, King Ethelred ordered a medieval attempt at genocide, the killing of all the Danes living in Saxon-controlled shires. Women were not spared, for among the murdered was Gunhilde, sister of the King of Denmark. Last year, in 2010, excavations at St. John's College, Oxford, unearthed 38 male skeletons in a single grave, testimony to what had happened. Historians writing to mitigate the dreadfulness of this deed accurately point out that the order could not have been followed in 2/3 of the kingdom, since outside the home counties the Danish presence was too preponderant. The corollary of this observation is that the kings of Wessex, in what is called the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England, controlled in effect only 1/3 of it. The atrocity and the murder of his sister provoked the Danish king Sven Tveskeg, Forkbeard, to mount a large-scale raid the following year. He returned in 1013, this time to settle the matter, landing with his army at Sandwich. Traversing the island, he soon received the submission of the Saxon thanes and the surrender of London, causing King Ethelred to flee the country with his family. By 1014, then, it looked as if the destiny of the crown of England appeared to be sealed. After a 2-century-long struggle, England was now a Danish realm. But another factor was coming into play. The until recently Danish, now becoming Frankish, political community of Normandy, just across the Channel. An emblematic and central figure in the complex intertwinings between Scandinavia, England and Normandy was Emma de Normandie, princess of the house of the Duke of Normandy, Richard. The Duke had angered Ethelred by allowing the Norse raiding flotillas, laden with spoils and tribute from their attacks across the Channel, to dock and trade their goods on the markets of Normandy, and to re-equip to launch further raids back in England. But already in 1002, Ethelred had formed a strategic alliance with Richard of Normandy and married his daughter Emma, whose Latinate name was substituted with the Germanic one of Elfgifu when she crossed the Channel. So it was in 1013, as the Danes besieged London, that Ethelred sent his wife and sons to Normandy for safety. Sven Tveskeg of the Danes died in England in 1014. The Danish fleet in East Anglia hailed his 20-year-old son Cnut as king, known to us as Cnut. The Saxon magnates, who a year before had acclaimed his father Sven as king of England, now turned back to Ethelred in Normandy. In the ensuing struggle, Cnut was victorious and Ethelred died. Cnut was crowned king of England and divided his now unitary realm into 4 great jarldömer, viceroyships, that of Wessex, Mercia, Ost Anglia, and Northumberland. Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, abandoned her own son Edmund and married Cnut to become queen of Danish England and of Denmark itself. Cnut den Store, Cnut the Great, a devout Christian who in 1027 had visited Pope Johannes XIX in Rome to attend the imperial coronation of Conradus II, and who was king of England, Denmark, Norway, and much else besides, Cnut died at Shaftesbury in November 1035. His residence in England showed that he regarded that kingdom as the centre of his realms. Emma had got on so well with her Danish husband that she effectively had ruled alongside him. She lost concern for her 2 sons by Ethelred, who continued to live in Normandy, and ruled Wessex as queen regent for her son by Cnut, Harda at this time in Denmark. In 1041, Harda who was childless, invited his half-brother, Emma's Anglo-Norman son, Edward, who had lived in Normandy for 25 years, back to England, where Harda recognized him as his successor to the crown of England. This was Edouard le Confesseur, Edward the Confessor, the last of the Wessex line, king of England from 1043. He spoke Norman French and surrounded himself with Norman and Frankish nobles and servants at his court. Many period experts, less enthralled to the nationalist narrative, recognize that his reign marked the beginning of the Normanization of England as a preparatory transition. England was being drawn away from the Danish sphere of influence and into that of the ex-Danish Normandy and of Francia generally. Edward's death in 1066 unleashed a chain of events which were to be the end game of the 2-century-long struggle for mastery of England. The complexities of the succession struggle, the revolt against Tostig in Northumbria, the overbearing power of the Godwin clan at court, the promise made by Edward to Guillaume of Normandy to be his heir, etc., cannot delay us here. Everyone knows that Guillaume of Normandy, William, Queen Emma's grandnephew, landed at Pevensey on the south coast of England in September 1066. The foremost scion of the Godwin clan, Harold Godwinson, was entrusted by Edward on his deathbed to be the protector of the kingdom. The Saxon magnates acclaimed him king of England in January 1066. In September also, Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, the man who had fought the Normans for the Roman emperor in southern Italy, landed with 300 ships and a large invasion force in Northumbria to claim the crown for himself. Most of us know that he was met and defeated by Harold Godwinson at Stengfordesbrücke, Stamford Bridge, where he met his death. The Saxon ruling class, the Jarls and Thanes, supporting King Harold, were utterly crushed by Duke Guillaume at Hastings, in October, where the most illustrious of them were killed. Guillaume advanced and surrounded London, where the remaining Saxon magnates were gathered. They opened the gates and paid him homage, as the legitimate heir of Edward the Confessor. Then began a period of a few years, several period specialists say, when the Duke of Normandy, crowned William I of England on Christmas Day 1066, sought to rule as he had claimed as Edward's rightful heir, with the loyal cooperation of the Saxon magnates. Confiscated estates of those at Hastings were distributed to his mixed followers from Normandy, Flanders, Brittany, and Francia, but the great estates of his new Saxon entourage were left untouched. There was also a sporadic resistance to the conquest. The sons of Godwinson launched raids from Ireland into Somerset, where they were met and defeated by the Saxon horse thane of the county, Cnut, loyal to the new regime. In September of 1069, the sons of the King of Denmark, Harald and Cnut, together with Jarl Asbjorn, landed with 250 ships at the Humber, where they were joined by some Saxon earls with the boy heir of the House of Wessex, Edgar. They took the newly constructed Norman forts at York by storm, and, quote, more than 3,000 of the Normans were killed and their ships drew off laden with plunder, end quote. This was a full-scale Danish invasion based on the Danelaw region of Northumbria and aimed at taking the whole country back for Denmark. It was this development which broke the accommodating transition of the new Norman regime, which turned to use the methods of a ruthless war of extirpation against the Danelaw. These events of 1069 and 1070 have gone down in history as the harrying of the North, but we know that the island had for the previous 2 centuries been ethnically and politically structured along an east-west axis, not a north-south one. The Danelaw was an ethnic and political reality, and it was against the Danelaw that Guillaume's warlords moved, starting out from their base at York. The harrying was a war against the population of the region as much against their lords, aimed at rendering the whole region of Northumbria a desert. Quote, King William hastened into Northumbria and spent the whole winter in laying waste the country, slaughtering the inhabitants and inflicting every sort of evil without cessation. End quote. He bribed the Danish Jarl Asbjorn to withdraw his section of the fleet, thus disabling the invasion. After 1070, over the following 2 decades, the majority of the Saxon and the Anglo-Danish ruling class were dispossessed of lands and offices, and were systematically replaced by the clients of the Duke of Normandy, noble and ecclesiastic. The prospect of a gradually and relatively peacefully emerging Normanno-Saxon England was destroyed when the Saxon reaction united with the great Danish invasion of 1069. The political, social, ecclesiastical and cultural future of England was to be French for the next 300 to 400 years. The title Rex and Lorem had been Englische Kung, King of the English. From now on it was to be Roi d'Angleterre,